why talk about authenticity? And also, what does it even mean to be authentic, right? I'm sure in your workspaces or in your classrooms, you've heard people talk about, bring your full self to work, bring your whole self, bring your authentic self. Like, there's a lot of chatter around that. And I think it's part of this cry out to make diversity and inclusion mean something real in how we're working, how we want to change work. It's speaking to culture, because we know that our business goals and our bottom line will always be stymied by how strong our cultures are. And so I love this quotation from Peter Drucker, who says, "Culture eats strategy for breakfast," and I'm sure it tastes delicious. And so that doesn't answer, like, okay, what does authenticity mean to me specifically, Jodi-Ann, right? And so I wanted to share a little bit of a story with you. So I had a meeting with an executive leader after a leadership brainstorming session. And she praised me for how my ideas and questions were really advancing the conversation and kind of opening up people's minds. And the shit sandwich starts, right? She's really supporting me in how I was showing up. But then she started scripting me, kind of pulled me into this role play of how I could sound more agreeable in meetings, and then maybe send the questions that I had later, via email after the meeting. And so as I was receiving this feedback, I tried to chat with her how that was landing and how it was mapping onto how women of color, particularly Black women, are treated in the workspace. And she said, "You know what, Jodi-Ann, I want you to be able to receive feedback without making it this larger issue, without connecting." And she started stumbling on her words. So I wanted to help her out, right? And so I said, "You mean without playing the race card?" Hoping that inflammatory language would be kind of a signal, like, "Mayday, mayday, they're lying, landmines all over," right? And she looked at me and she's like, "Exactly." And it was that moment where I decided that I was going to leave that job, because my engagement, my passions, my contributions were not going to be valued there. And so when I think about how I show up at work, how I'm being authentic in the workspace, I want my critical thinking skills to be assets, not a liability. I should be able to engage in a brainstorming meeting without my contributions being negatively interpreted. I want transparency. I don't want to assimilate to the regular ways people are communicating. I should be able to integrate my personal identities as a woman, as a person of color, a Black woman with an afro, as someone who's an immigrant, someone who's living with a physical, invisible disability. I should be able to pull that into conversations without having to navigate around the comfort of others. And when I'm being vulnerable, when I'm integrating these identities into my work, I should be rewarded, not punished. I shouldn't have to fear the loss of social capital or professional opportunities for talking about issues of identity or equity. And so these conversations around authenticity, they're so valuable in that it's enabled us to have that conversation. It's bringing awareness to these different types of issues about how people are showing up in the workspace, and maybe that can motivate our work cultures towards action to solve for that. And so some of these enabling factors are that it exposes the fact that underrepresented or marginalized individuals may be experiencing different realities at work. When we talk about bringing your full self, that means you're acknowledging that there's a segment of your workforce that can't do that. They're putting in more time and energy to cover themselves, to mask part of who they are in order to come to work, which ultimately impacts your bottom line and your strategy. Being able to talk about authenticity as opposed to racism, right? It provides this safe and shared language that can raise really complicated issues more openly. I can have a shared language as someone who wants to talk about race or ableism with someone who's a parent and wants to have that identity be able to show up in work. Another enabling factor is that it can support a happier, productive, more innovative workforce when people don't have to expend that energy trying to cover themselves. And so I like to thank authenticity and that whole discourse for that. And then I want to move forward, right? Because when we dig into what authenticity means, it can certainly create change in the workspace, and it has, but it has limitations to truly transform. And change and transformation are really, really different, and that transformation has to happen at a structural level. And so when I think about when someone says, oh, bring your authentic self to work. Like me, I'm already underrepresented and marginalized, and so I have to take on that risk and that responsibility to show up in this environment. And so it disproportionately burdens those who are already underrepresented and privileges those who are already closer to a dominant culture. And to be honest, we actually don't want this for everyone. There are people that are like completely like racist, misogynist, ableist, homophobic, all of these identities that they're bringing into the workspace, and we don't want that there, right? And so authenticity as a term, as a way of being, has limitations. It's really about the workplace values and not necessarily the individual and the identities and the perspectives that they're bringing. And so even though we have this safe and shared language to talk about authenticity, it starts to oversimplify and eventually starts conflating these real issues of equity and discrimination at work. And so when I say authentic, it's not that I want people to be nice to me. I want a promotion at the same rate as someone else who's coming at the same time as me. Like, we're talking about real challenging issues. And so to speak about authenticity can really stymie real understanding and meaningful action to address those issues. And lastly, it's such a strong focus individually on the person and not as much on the system. And so it takes too much of an individualistic approach to a system level problem, which I think is really relevant here because we're talking about how we can take systems to scale. How can we scale culture, right? That can't happen on this like one-on-one basis. When we focus too much on individuals, we lose the fact that individuals drive institutions. And so when I introduced my talk, I said, showing up authentically. Who? Are we talking about people, or are we talking about structures and systems and institutions? And so I like to talk about bringing your authentic self to work if you think about a Halloween party. And so let's just say your friend calls you up and say, hey, I got a party on Saturday. I totally get that it's on Halloween. It is not a Halloween party. Just like show up as your authentic self. You don't have to wear a costume. Show up to this party. And you get to the party, and every other person is in a costume, including your friend who invited you, right? And so now you risk your social capital. You look like the one who's the oddball because you showed up as yourself and everyone else is in costume. And so not only is everyone else in costume, but there's like an official costume contest, and there are like all these activities directly related to your costume, and you can't participate. And so when we bring that analogy back into the workplace, that costume contest is your promotion. That's your social capital. Those are your reach projects. Those are your mentors. Those are your sponsors. That's your raise, right? There are all these ways that being at work, you get rewarded for showing up in a certain way. And if, as an individual, you take the risk to not show up in your costume, you can really be at a disadvantage. And that exacerbates when that person is already marginalized. A woman, queer person, person of color, disabled folks, we're already coming behind in a certain sense in terms of that social capital and access. And so again, when we think about, and I love the social ecological model, like it's my favorite thing. So when we think about society, I think when we talk about authenticity, we've completely over-indexed for individuals and how individuals relate to each other interpersonally, when we can really be driving institutions and driving the community in terms of how institutions relate to each other. So I want to bring this down to an example to just contextualize this individual versus this institutional space. And so Alicia Montano, she's an Olympic runner, a middle distance runner. She's US national champion, and she was completely celebrated for running during both of her pregnancies. In this first image, she's about 5 months pregnant, and in the second image, if you believe, she competed 8 months pregnant. Insane. And so here's Alicia, right, showing up as a pregnant woman, her authentic self, to her job, right? And she was absolutely celebrated for that representation because it's so important, not just when we talk about pregnant women and exercise, but being able to be a pregnant woman working. Like, this is her job. Like, so it was a huge effort for her to be able to have that representation and take on that risk. And then fast forward, she wrote an incredible op-ed in the New York Times, and it has a beautifully produced video where she exposes Nike and how they sponsor athletes, right? So if you're pregnant or if you're a nursing mother, you don't get those sponsorship dollars, right? They don't sponsor you if you're not running or you're not doing your activity. And so there was no strong maternity leave policy. There was no system to support her to show up being authentic as a pregnant athlete. And so I definitely recommend that y'all check out this video. It's absolutely incredible. And so that happened. Not too long after that, Nike expands their maternity policy, right? And so through that public outcry and through Alicia and other runners putting their social capital, putting their dollars on the line, they spoke out and they were able to make a change. And so when we think about companies, when they're trying to manage this PR kind of a nightmare, but also companies that are really digging into this diversity and inclusion space and thinking about values and impacts in really, really big ways, you have to then say, how is that reflected in the actual company, how we're actually making decisions, what we're actually doing to create these systems. And so there's this authenticity gap, right? Some dissonance between what we say we stand for, who we want to be, and how decisions are actually being made and where resources are going. And so how can we close this gap? First step is to evaluate, right? Where are you now? And how did you get there? Really doing that work of how you got there. And where do you want to be? And what tools do you have at your disposal in order to get there? Next, you want to define. What are the values or the guiding principles that can help you? And then where can you state and share them in a way that it'll be used? And so not just internally, but publicly, and have some transparency so your customers and people who have eyes on you can hold you accountable. And what are some hard truths that you're willing to admit? Nike could have totally said, like, yeah, we're not going to extend our maternity policy. Maybe there are some limitations with that. What can you actually admit to yourself of what you want to be a part of, or what capacity you have to really make change? And so what are the critical levers of how culture is shaped within your company? And most importantly, what risks are you willing to take to reach your goals? And when I say you, I don't mean individuals, I mean as a company. Lastly, you want to align. So when you have a good sense of where you want to be, who you are right now, and the path of how you're going to get there, the path is restructuring your policies, practices, and accountability mechanisms of how decisions are made. And so this is a paradigm shift in a sense of like unconscious bias trainings and a lot of this like hearts and minds approach of shifting culture. Really dig into how work happens and what the cultural norms are within your company. And then you want to integrate and operationalize core concepts of intersectionality, equity, and belonging. And then again, be honest, disclose your limitations and the strategies that you have for progress. And so we've talked about race, we've talked about gender, and another thing I really like to talk about are social styles. As a Black woman, as a woman who's from New York City, now living in the Pacific Northwest, there are a lot of parts of my identity that's created this social style around thinking and speaking at the same time, right? There are a lot of people who can think and speak at the same time who don't share my identity, so it could be a good case study for our conversation. Now, there are some people who think and speak at the same time, and then there are others who think and then they speak. Now, in a vacuum, both of these social styles are completely valuable, right? They're neither positive, they're not negative, they're very neutral. But when we bring that into the workspace, being someone who can think and speak at the same time is highly privileged, right? People look at you as a leader, someone who's more confident, you get more speaking opportunities, you get to represent the company. It's a social style that has a lot of advantages at work. Now, we leave behind people who think and then they speak. Again, there's nothing wrong with having that social style, and in some contexts is actually better if you're thinking about, some domestic conflicts of how you want to negotiate issues with your partner. Being able to think and then speak can be very helpful, right? But in the work context, someone who thinks and then they speak we have all these negative characteristics for them, right? Like maybe they're being deceptive, they're making stuff up, they're not prepared, they're shy, they're like all these negative attributes, they're not confident just because you think and then speak. And so if you're a company that evaluates your norms and realizes that you privilege people who think and speak at the same time, you can make a choice. Hey, we don't want to be like that anymore. And so when you're thinking about your meeting structure, for people who think and speak at the same time, which are highly valued, versus people who think and then they speak, you can say, hey, we're going to set out a detailed meeting agenda. We're going to have reading or writing activities during that meeting, maybe post-it note activities where people can write things down before they share out publicly. And maybe we use some digital platforms to be able to, any remaining thoughts, be able to share that publicly with the people who are in that meeting. In that case, people who think and speak at the same time and people who think and then they speak have equal footing in that meeting. And so we can take that example and extrapolate that to people with different identities, different applications, but really thinking about the choices that we make and the environments and the structures that we create so people can come to it with their authentic selves. Now, you can totally decide that you want to be a think and speaking company, right? And so the question is, if that's a culture that you want to build, are you going to be relevant for the future of work? Do people want to work there? Do people want to build with you? Do people feel like they have the space to be innovative and creative in that type of environment, right? Being able to be honest about that allows people to opt in or opt out of your company, and then you have to really think about the longevity of that approach. And so I'll end here in thinking about authenticity in the future of work, that there's a lot of work that we need to do in order to ensure that our environments are ready for people who want to come to it with their full selves, right? And if that doesn't happen, that doesn't work, that impacts what's happening even right now. And so the future of work is right now. It's happening right now, and we need to catch up. Thank you so much.